we are going to celebrate the 5152nd year of Vishnu Sahasranama, which has been a legacy and heritage preserved by our country and the people of Bharat. For countless generations, this has been preserved by our people, pursued with tenacity, and also bequeathed to the succeeding generations. I am wondering whether anywhere in this world you can find this kind of a literary treasure. If you go into it, it is a cultural treasure of India. We are finding that the Vishnu Sahasranama is part of Mahabharatam, one of the two epics which our country has produced, with all kinds of distinction that you can think of. I thought our people as well as the world should come to know what is this Vishnu Sahasranama, a legacy of India, which has been preserved continuously for countless millennia in this country. I sometimes wonder whether there is any country in this world which has this kind of a legacy or a heritage preserved for such a long time. It is necessary that the people of India in particular and the world at large come to know that there is such a treasure available as a common property and heritage for all of them. Anything in the field of knowledge, anything in the field of culture is not the selected property of any select population. It's always something to be possessed and also utilized by all people in the whole world. That is the idea with which we are trying to celebrate this 5152nd year of Vishnu Sahasranama. One intention is to know that we have got such a long age heritage on the one hand, and this heritage should be made available to all the world homes of the world. All the world homes. This is our intention. I would like to tell you something about Mahabharatam on the one hand, and to some extent Ramayana also. Mahabharata was written and composed at the end of Dwapara Yuga. Now we are running 5,000 and odd years of Kali Yuga. Naturally, this text was written more than 5,000 years back. What about Ramayana? Ramayana belongs to the prehistoric period. Because it is prehistoric, historic records are not there to tell us anything about it. According to our mythological calculations, Ramayana was composed in Treta Yuga. Treta Yuga precedes Dwapara Yuga. Dwapara Yuga precedes the present Kali Yuga. So if you calculate the number of years according to the Puranic calculations, it will go to a number of thousands and thousands of years back. So I am not going into it. We have the ageless literature, age-old and ageless literature called Vedas. In the Vedas, we have an Upanishadic section which deals with the supreme reality, the inmost self, and the ultimate reality of the whole world. The ultimate reality in the world is called Brahman, the supreme reality. Then the self is called Paramatma, and religiously the same source is identified as God. Hinduism clearly says that the inmost self called Paramatma, the ultimate reality called Parabrahman, and God, the ultimate in religion or religious concepts, all the three are really one. The Upanishadic truths are very subtle, and it requires perhaps a very sharp and penetrating intelligence to do the necessary introspection in order to arrive at the contemplations suggested by or exhorted by the Upanishads and reach at the supreme level of comprehension. So it's not available to all people. At the same time, the benefit of the Upanishadic findings will have to be made available to all concerned. Therefore, they evolved a special type of literature called epics. We have two epics, one is Ramayana, another is Mahabharata. Ramayana deals with the life history of the prince and king Sri Rama. Rama has become so popular only because of Ramayana. This Ramayana was penned by a sage called Valmiki. He was earlier in his pre-sannyasa or pre-ascetic life a forest dacoit called by the name Ratnakara. Ratnakara, by virtue of his accidental contact and association with a group of sages, got completely transformed. They asked him to sit in a place and only chant Rama, 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 Rama. So he went on chanting. He was not literate, so not much of an instruction in the way of a wise gospel or counsel could have been given to him. So they told him in a very simple manner, chant Rama, 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 Rama. He went on chanting Rama, 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 Rama. Initially perhaps a little loud utterance there was. Then the voice declined and declined. Ultimately the lip movements alone were there, and finally they also stopped. In the mind he went on chanting. Ultimately the chanting became subtler, lighter and feebler, to such an extent that the whole process stopped and ceased forever. This is where you reach the supreme source of not merely ourselves, but the whole creation. He went on remaining completely embraced by that silence, inner communion for countless number of years. Our legend says, our writings say that Ratnagara was completely enraptured by anthill, and by the time he came out, he was called by all people the Valmiki Maharshi, an ascetic who came out of the anthill. So we know him as a Maharshi by the name Valmiki, the word Valmika indicating anthill. He was himself a dacoit. By contact and association of a set of saints in the forest accidentally, whom he wanted to rob first, but he could not. They had nothing to be robbed. On the other hand, their sight and their looks, graceful looks, robbed him of his stealth and deceit. This is what happened. There ensued a conversation between them, and ultimately, the whole Ratnagara, his life was completely transformed. He became an ascetic. He was wondering as to how to bring about a similar transformation in the minds of a number of people in the plains. I was a forest dweller, and I had the opportunity to come in contact with, though accidentally, a set of saints. And their association completely transformed me. This kind of a physical privilege may not be available to the others. May not be, is not available. So I should give them a kind of an eternal, ever relevant and ever present association, by virtue of which all the stealth, deceit, theft and other items will be removed from their mind. What to do for that? He was wondering. Then came the suggestion that he should write the story of Sri Rama. How did it happen? He was sitting in contemplation. What shall I do? What shall I do? What shall I do? Suddenly the sage Narada visited him. He was very happy that without any invitation or without even any advance notice, such a great sage Narada had come to his cottage, hermitage. He was very happy, he welcomed him. He had one question to ask. What will the sages discuss? They will always discuss something in the way of spirituality, morality, ethics, and how to improve the plight and fate of the people at large. This will be the only constant concern in their mind. My dear sage, Valmiki said, you are given to traveling in the whole world, and you ramble very freely unhindered. You must have come to know of many things in this world. I have one enquiry from my heart. I would like to know whether there is anybody living now. Living now. Don't tell me of anybody who lived earlier, and only you have a history of that person. I would like you to tell me of somebody who lives now, who is very good, noble, great, valorous, illustrious, courageous, who has all the qualities as well as the power, valor and excellence. I don't want to listen to the story of any weak or a meek man. I want to know about a heroic person. At the same time, he must have extreme morality, righteousness and ethics to govern his life. Such a person, if you know about, please tell me. I think he couched it in this kind of a line. Konvasmin sampradam loge gunavan yascha viryavan. I want to know of a qualitative, virtuous man, at the same time viryavan, extremely valorous, powerful and courageous. Narada had no time, no doubt at all. He said, yes, I have seen such a person. He is the first son of King Dasharatha. He is still growing, he is still a boy. To the extent I know of his story, I shall tell you. The remaining you sit in contemplation and find out. Narada gave some details and he disappeared. Valmiki sat in contemplation and found out what was the life to come for Sri Rama. After that, he started rendering the whole story into poetry. This is what you call Ramayana that you have. It is 24,000 Sanskrit verses. Why did I tell you this? There is only one purpose. Our Ramayana is actually a biography written by Valmiki about Sri Rama, who was much younger to him and whose life was still in a budding stage and it was growing. Valmiki, the author, had all access to Ayodhya, where Rama lived, so that he could understand how he was flowering as a prince, and became a king. And he started writing. Later on, it so happened, as Providence would favor him, Rama was married to Sita, Sita was pregnant, and Sri Rama had to abandon Sita before her confinement. And he chose to abandon her at the doorsteps of Valmiki. Lakshmana took her, left her there, and after leaving, Lakshmana communicated the message of Rama, "You stand abandoned by my brother." This is what he said. Valmiki's disciples spotted her. Lakshmana had already gone. They came and reported to him that a young, good-looking, pregnant lady is there crying and weeping. The sage went himself to find out who that person was. On seeing her, she said, "I know all the story. I am not going to blame you the least, nor am I going to blame your husband. Come, I will arrange for your care and nursing, both before and after confinement." Thus, the pregnant Sita became his daughter, and Leva and Kusha, her sons, almost his grandsons. What he started as a biographical narration, from now on became an autobiographical narration. So you can understand the veracity of Valmiki's statements, the authority, the authenticity, the completeness, the identification he had with all that happened. This is the Ramayana that we have. It is actually the history of human behavior, the history of human life, but presented in such an epic style, the purpose being to instill at every stage in the minds of the readers what are the truths, principles, values, restraints, ideals, reformation, refinement, ethics, and all that should govern human life. It is a narration of the things of the past, of the life of the past, but the narration is made in such a manner that every page of it tries to drive home to the readers or to the listeners what are the values and restraints and goals relevant to human life in every era forever. This is the beauty of the two epics that we have. Now, Ramayana is a very distant one. In spite of the distance it carries, understand that the original Ramayana is even now available in the form of print before all of us. Sage Valmiki would certainly have penned only one scripture or one narration, one Ramayana. We have no access to what he wrote originally. We don't have that palm leaf grantha, that text we don't have. Nor do we know where he lived. We don't have a picture or any kind of a memoir relating to his cottage. At the same time, we have Ramayana in full measure. Nobody wants to get any syllable change there. This is the greatness of India. I would like all of you to know it. When was it written? Countless millennia earlier, and even now, the scriptural composition is available before us. This is the greatness of our people, greatness of your predecessors. All of you, every one of you, belongs to this kind of a generation, this kind of a society that has inhabited in this holy land. I would like you to know it and feel an ample measure of pride in being an Indian, in being a classical Indian. Understand it very well. Now, when we come to Mahabharata, it is very close to us. It was written 5,000 and odd years back, just before the commencement of Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga has already run more than 5,000 years. The difference between the two is, Ramayana tells us about the beautiful brotherhood that prevailed during Valmiki's time in the palace of Ayodhya. Whereas Mahabharata describes before us. It narrates what? The decline and fall of the Kuru dynasty. Kuru dynasty ruled part of India for a long period. And because of decline of personal values, some of the people became greed-oriented, possessiveness-oriented. They wanted to grab things and riches belonging to the others. They were never satisfied. That inner reformation and refinement were deplorably lacking in them. As a result of that, the whole life was vitiated. They will not themselves live peacefully, nor will they allow the others to live peacefully. There was a clear difference, a rift between the cousin brothers. They wanted partition of the land, and the land was partitioned. When the partitioned land was given to Yudhishthira and party, Duryodhana was not happy at all. Yudhishthira and party soiled and sweated considerably much, and they prospered well. The entire Indraprastha became very, very prosperous, affluent by all means. Duryodhana was not able to sleep, coming to know of their prosperity and promotion. So he wanted to somehow win back what was given to them, arranged a game of dice in which his own uncle played very deceitfully. Ultimately, they drove them to the forest for 12 years, to be followed by 1 year of incognito life. All this was over, and they came back, asked for the kingdom. He was not prepared to give at all. Now, this is the story of Mahabharata. What will anybody do? Personal greed is all right, but greed in the mind of a prince or a king is very disastrous. A king rules a land, and if king is corrupt, the entire country suffers. So it was no more a question between the cousin brothers as such. It was concerning the welfare of the great Kuru dynasty and the people who were under that rule. So matters came to such a climax. Now I wanted to give you something like a relevance of Vishnu Sahasranama. And you may wonder why Swamiji is speaking about Mahabharata, Ramayana, etc. Yes, there is a reason. Vishnu Sahasranama is a part of Mahabharata. Out of the 18 Parvas Mahabharata has, Vishnu Sahasranama and associated details are from Shanti Parva and Anushasana Parva of Mahabharata. And Mahabharata being a narration of the decline and fall of the Kuru dynasty, you should understand it is not just a religious text to be disposed of in that manner. It is a part of a narration. In the present day, shall I say, it's a political narration. It's a narration of our monarchs, of our kings who rule the country, whose behavior, whose character, whose interaction with the people certainly affected the fate and plight of the whole multitudes they governed. So it has very great relevance. And everything that is discussed in Mahabharata is discussed in such a manner that it is instilling, as I already said, Dharma, Artha, Kama and Moksha, the fourfold Purushartha, the objectives of human life. So the other incidents of Mahabharatam may be forgotten. But insofar as the narration is dharmic and ethical in character, not even for a moment we can be distant from it. We have to be constantly in link with the Mahabharata narration. So also Ramayana. Now the Vishnu Sahasranama occurring in Mahabharatam, it has been preserved by our people. In so many nooks and corners of India, Vishnu Sahasranama is being chanted and recited. In my pre-sannyasa life, when I was about 6 or 7 years old, my mother one day asked me, learn to recite Vishnu Sahasranama. You know, I was born and I was brought up in a remote village of Kerala in India. There was nothing like a radio, a newspaper, reading room, library or anything like that at all. From where shall we get Vishnu Sahasranama? Printing and circulation was much, much rarer those days. Somehow or other, I was able to get some torn pieces. The book was already torn, the pages were torn. Some kind of a book I got. Then, looking into the letters with my eyes, I started pronouncing the words through my tongue and mouth. And with the ears, I started hearing them. And after hearing them, again applying my mind and intelligence, I was verifying whether what I saw and what I uttered were really in harmony with each other. So it was a process of self-learning, self-examination, self-correction and self-improvement. Like that, I learned Vishnu Sahasranama right from that young age, and it has been with me all along. In our ashram, you will find, as a part of the morning congregational austerity that goes on here, previously, every day Vishnu Sahasranama and 1 or 2 chapters of Bhagavad Gita were constantly recited. Now we have reduced this recitation and added something like Prabhata Rashmi, the content of which many of you must be listening to or reading now and then. So at least on alternate days, we chant Vishnu Sahasranama as an austerity. And this Vishnu Sahasranama takes us directly to Mahabharata and what Vedavyasa had written 5,151 years ago. This is what I want to know. Anybody who chants Vishnu Sahasranama suddenly gets inwardly connected to that remote period, that remote year where sage Vedavyasa wrote Mahabharata, incorporating Vishnu Sahasranama in it. So it is 5,151 years old. We would like to announce this to the entire multitudes of the world, primarily to the people of India. They chant this as a devotional item. Many of them are molded by it. Many derive a lot of unending inspiration from it. Many are getting transformed. Many derive purity. A number of people gain a number of qualities which are mentioned in the form of words in Vishnu Sahasranama. But alas, nobody knows the historic facts and relevance of the text. We thought we will announce it. What is the reason for it? It is because of our cultural patriotism, which we cherish and nourish a great deal. Our country is not merely a geographical subcontinent. We have got a people who are noted for their cultural depth, cultural elegance, cultural magnificence and splendor. If India is great, it is great because of her culture. Culture does not need the facility of economic prosperity. For us, poverty and riches at one point of time become equal. There are kings in this land who abandoned the throne and then went to the forest to live there in solitary solitude and austerity. And then they gained an inner treasure, which often they have recorded in beautiful, immortal literature. Bhartrihari, for instance, is one of an illustrious fame. So this is the story of Vishnu Sahasranama. Now, this Vishnu Sahasranama occurs in the Kurukshetra battlefield. If you go through Mahabharatam as a whole, as I told you, it describes the decline and fall of the Kuru dynasty. The entire declining process finally led Yudhishthira on the one hand and his team, and Duryodhana on the other hand and his team, both of them went to the battlefield of Kurukshetra. This Kurukshetra has got a great fame. What is that fame? Dharmakshetre Kurukshetre Samaveta Yuyutsavaha Mamakah Pandavaschaiva Kimakurvata Sanjaya. The first sloka of Bhagavad Gita is, in the Kurukshetra battlefield, which is famous for Dharma, which is recognized as a Dharmakshetra, my sons as well as the Pandavas, they went there. And what did they do? This was the enquiry made by the blind king Dhritarashtra to Sanjaya, the narrator. So both of them went to the battlefield. And what for? Only to battle. But before the battle commenced, there was something that transpired there. That was not battle at all. Both of them had raised war cries. Bhishma raised it first, and then the whole of his team. To reciprocate it, none from the Pandava side was ready. Then Sri Krishna blew his conch Panchajanya. Following that, all of them raised their cries. So the war was literally announced. We are ready to fight and we are ready to counter the fight. Now only discharge of arrows was about to take place. Right at that point of time, Arjuna asked his charioteer Sri Krishna to drive the chariot in front and station it in a very suitable position so that he could examine both the armies. Krishna drove the chariot to the presence of Bhishma and Drona, and then Arjuna looked at them and the others around. Yes, everything was over. The heroic, the valorous, the impatient, the fighter with a lot of warring enthusiasm suddenly crumbled in the battlefield. His famous Gandiva slipped from his fist. he was unable to hold it. The whole body went into a tremor. The mouth went dry. The mind was swirling. His intelligence was saying, this is a sinful war. Don't fight it at all. This is what he said. And ultimately, unable to stand, he sat on the battlefield, leaving his weapons below. This is the situation. Tell me now, what does it mean? He had 13 years of preparation, and he had come with a lot of austerity and austere rewards. Pashupadastra was one such, Gandiva was another. With all these resources additionally acquired, he now finds that he cannot fight. For what reason? For his own mind's reason. The mind was whirling round like a whirlwind. He was unable to stand. He spoke his distress to Krishna and told him, I will not fight at all. Krishna exhorted him in a few words. Suddenly he picked up some kind of a sensitiveness in him. Then he became an inquirer. Sitting in that battlefield, he said, Yat shreyasyan nishchitam bruhitan me shishyasteham shadhimam tvam prapannam. Tell me what is supreme shreyas for me. Shreyas is a kind of a felicity that you can think of. It is to be acquired by the mind and the intelligence inwardly. It is not something like property, money, gold, etc. It is a treasure that your mind and intelligence alone can strive for and gain in ample measure. So tell me what is supreme shreyas. My dear viewers, think for a moment. Where is Arjuna in the battlefield of Kurukshetra? After what? 13 years of preparation he has come there. He was waiting for this occasion to display his skill and win the war. So the long-awaited opportunity had presented itself. Right at that point, he crumbled. He crumbled, and the war was no more in his mind. He started seeking shreyas, which spiritual seekers will look for. Suddenly, you can yearn for shreyas anywhere in your life. Any field is welcome. The war is no outcast for it. Anywhere and everywhere, you can be a seeker of shreyas. What is this shreyas? To remove all kinds of grief from the mind and to install ceaseless and abundant joyfulness. This is called shreyas. It is something called nitya nirantara sukha. It is a state of comfort and contentment that will grace the human mind and heart forever unbrokenly. That is what he wanted. Now, Sri Krishna had only a short time, something like 2 or 2.5 hours. So a dialogue ensued between them. And at the end of the dialogue, Arjuna was quite stable. He was very happy, and he got up, took back his bow and arrow and said, I will fight not one, a score of Mahabharata wars. As you say, he said to Krishna. Now, what I want to point out to you is the decline and fall of the Kuru dynasty as narrated by Vedavyasa is a one-time incident. We can read it, understand it, such a thing transpired. But this dialogue that transpired before the war, enabling and empowering Arjuna to fight, it is a dialogue which has got constant and continuing relevance to the human mind and intelligence and heart, anywhere, anytime, any era in the world. This is what I want to convey. I told you there were 2 instances which stand apart from war. This is not war. This is only an ethical gospel, an ethical dialogue that transpired between Arjuna and Krishna. Arjuna got up, the fight began. It continued for 18 days. All people who had assembled there, something like 4.5 million warriors were there, except 10. All fell dead. All fell dead. Can you imagine? Initially, before the commencement of the war, Arjuna's grief, agitation and agony were thinking about the consequence of war. The war is sinful. I will not fight. All of us will be condemned in hell. This is what he bewailed. Now, at the end of the war, all people had fallen dead. Yudhishthira had won. Pandavas were there. Everything was over. Now, when people die in the battlefield, with that the enmity also is lost. It was all dead bodies and dead bodies. How many dead bodies were there? Countless. More than 4.5 million, as I said. So, for the first time in the history of our country, countless number of widows and other relatives of the departed people had assembled in the battlefield. All the dead bodies were not disposed of. Eagles were preying on them. Crows also were picking them. Many heaps of pyre were formed. All the chariots, their wheels, their bodies, their tops, everything was cut into pieces and thrown into the fire. The fire was blazing and the dead bodies were thrown into them. Everywhere there was smoke, dead smoke, dense smoke with the smell of carcasses. Such a tragic scene followed there. And all the women had come, what for? To offer oblations to the departed people. At that point of time, no enmity was there. It was all friendship, concern, mutuality and collectivity. Under the leadership of Yudhishthira, who had won the war, these countless number of women had assembled. Yudhishthira, followed by all of them, they were all getting into Bhagirathi, the holy river, to touch the water, take handsful of water and offer as oblations to the departed souls. Right at that point of time when they were getting down, Kunti, the mother of the Pandavas, came running with disheveled hair, beating her chest and the head. She was crying aloud, and finally she told Yudhishthira, "My dear son, offer oblations to your elder brother Karna," she said. What? Offer oblations to your elder brother Karna also. Everything gone. Everything gone. Can you imagine? Yudhishthira was unwilling to fight the war. He was prepared to settle even for one house with 5 rooms in a village. He never wanted this kind of a massive bloodshed. But he tried his level best to avoid it. Sent Krishna himself as an ambassador. But there was no effect at all. Finally, the war was forced on him. With a lot of unwillingness, agony, resistance, revolt and whatnot, he agreed to fight and lead the war. Now this is what he hears. He started lamenting and lamenting and lamenting. He said, "What is this? Why did not my mother tell me any time earlier that Karna was my elder brother?" Karna was the one person on whose warring ability Duryodhana had a lot of faith. Only on the basis of Karna, who alone could contend Arjuna, he decided to fight the war. That Karna, if he was the elder brother of Yudhishthira, Yudhishthira says, if I had known it, I would have completely surrendered myself before him, fallen at his feet and made him our leader. The entire war could have been avoided. Why did not my mother tell me? No answer, no answer. What could he do? Somehow he completed the oblational measures and then came out and said, I will never sit on the throne. I am not going to rule the country. Previously, I was banished to the forest, defeated in the game of dice. Now this time, I am going to go there optionally myself. For the entire life of mine, I will be eating leaves and fruits from the forest. The whole life will be one of austerity, in atonement for whatever sin I have done. He could not be consoled by anybody. Arjuna spoke, Bhima spoke, Nagula and Sahadeva spoke. Even Krishna, who could set right the mind of Arjuna before the war, he failed. His words had no effect at all. It was then that Vedavyasa started speaking to him something. Somehow, Yudhishthira's mind was involved in what Vedavyasa was saying. So he wanted to inquire something more from Vyasadeva. Some idea presented by him was not clear. Then when he asked for clarification, Vyasadeva said, no, not I. Your grandfather is lying there in the bed of arrows, awaiting the arrival of Uttarayana for shedding his body. He still represents the entire Kurukshetra war. On your enemy side, all the others have died, I agree, but Bhishma is still surviving. He has no enmity towards you, nor do you have. Although you fought him and made him fall from the chariot, there is no enmity between you at all. He is as graceful, as kind, as loving, as benevolent to you as he was earlier. Go to him. He is the right person to give you the message of peace and consolation. Yudhishthira understood the gravity of what he said. Again he started lamenting. How can I go to my grandfather? I am so cruel. When I asked him, my dear grandfather, as long as you are up and active with bow and arrow, nobody can defeat you. I cannot win the war. So tell me how you can be made to fall from the chariot. Bhishma then said, keep Shikhandin in front. The moment I see him, I will lay down my weapons, I will not fight. Let Arjuna fight from behind. This is the secret he disclosed. And adopting that kind of an expediency or a stratagem, I was able to defeat him. Now such a person, now having won the war, going to him and asking him, I have no peace, please instruct me how I can get peace. Is it possible? What a shameless approach will it be? And where do I have the guts to do it? So Krishna, you should yourself take us, present me before my grandfather and initiate the dialogue between us. Krishna agreed, took all of them, went to Bhishma and started the conversation. How are you, my dear grandfather? You are lying on a bed of arrows. So many arrows have thrust deeply into your body. Even if a little thorn pricks my foot, I am in excruciating pain. I don't know how you bear it. What about your memory? Are you able to think clearly? Are ideas clear, etc.? Then Bhishma said, yes, there is a lot of pain. I suffer, I bear it. So far as memory is concerned, it is not completely gone, but it is still very thin, very lean memory I have. But after your arrival, coming to know of you, seeing you, I become a lot enthused. Maybe I shall be able to speak for a while. Then Krishna presented the plight of Yudhishthira and asked him to advise him, and the conversation started. I again tell you that there are two instances. One is before the war, another is after the war. The dialogue that transpired between Bhishma and Yudhishthira is very, very long, comprehensive. It runs into several chapters. The whole of Shanti Parva is full of it, with many, many chapters. It's a comprehensive gospel where all aspects of dharma, particularly Raja Dharma, are discussed. The grandfather had the mission of consoling his grandson. He said, look, my dear son, the Kshatriya's life is something very, very tragic. We know it. But you should understand, there is only one method. Whatever is gone is gone. Whatever is gone is gone. The wheel of history cannot be, the wheel of time cannot be reversed. The incidents are already over. They are not going to repeat. What you have is a memory. What you have is a memory. This memory can be treated. There is a way for it. Listen to me. In this way, he started speaking. I cannot think of going into the whole conversation at all. Even Bhagavad Gita consists of 18 chapters. Here it runs into hundreds of chapters. The Shanti Parva consists of 365 chapters. So, how can I think of referring to it at all? But I would like to say at least some cardinal verses insofar as they are relevant to our discussion about the relevance of Vishnu Sahasranama. Yudhishthira speaks to Bhishma in this manner, the grandfather. Kshatra dharmadhipabiyad na dharmosti naradhipa apayanena yuddhena raja handi mahajanam. Dhritarashtra was saying, Daruna kshatra dharmoyam rishibhi sampradarshitaha. The kshatra dharma, the warrior duty is extremely cruel, excruciating and agonizing. This is what has been ordained for them. Even brothers will fight, relatives will fight. When it comes to a question of conflicting ideals, they cannot have any loyalty at all beyond the Kshatriya duty. So, Kshatra dharmadhipabiyad na dharmosti naradhipa apayanena yuddhena raja hanti mahajanam. See, there is no dharma, no discipline or ethics which is worse than the Kshatriya duty, the Kshatra dharma. That is the most cruel and agonizing and very, very painful. Apayanena yuddhena raja hanti mahajanam. In war, they will bring about a mass slaughter. Even when they are returning, in the return also they will kill a number of people. Apayanena yuddhena raja hanti mahajanam. In the war, they have to kill mercilessly quite a number of people, not looking into their faces, not having any consideration at all. Whoever confronts them will be dispatched to death. This is their role. See, in my war, what has happened? 4.5 million people have been killed. A number of others also were involved in the whole process. Quite a number was missing. Now, this is what is the situation. Kshatra dharmadhipabiyan na dharmosti naradhipa apayanena yuddhena raja hanti mahajanam. This was the summary statement made by Yudhishthira. Hearing it, Bhishma says, he meets that argument and he presents his own statement. Nigrahena cha papanam sadhunam sangrahena cha yajnair danaischa rajano bhavandi shujayo amalaha. I am reading this from Shanti Parva, chapter number 97, verse 1 and 3. This is what I am quoting now. Nigrahena cha papanam sadhunam sangrahena cha yajnair danaischa rajano bhavandi shujayo amalaha. My dear grandson, what you say is true. I agree with you that the warrior dharma, the kshatriya dharma is extremely cruel and they have to destroy a number of people. Whom are they destroying? They are only destroying and killing those people who confront them in the battlefield. Now in Kurukshetra, who are the people who assembled Duryodhana's team and your team? What did Duryodhana represent? Duryodhana represented wickedness, cruelty, vice of the worst order. Every one of us tried to dissuade him. I tried, Drona tried, Vidura tried, Dhritarashtra, his own father, tried, Gandhari also tried, Kripacharya also tried. Every one of us tried to dissuade him from his immoral adventure, but he would not budge an inch. And being a Yuvaraja, he alone has to say what should be and what should not be. We can advise them at best, but we cannot order them. That is against the principle of morality and ethics. So Duryodhana held to his feet. He did not change at all. When such a situation comes, what can be done? Suppose this Duryodhana and team are allowed to flourish in this world, what will happen? The society and the country will have a wicked regime and rule. Is it all right? When you are all living there and you can confront them, if you don't confront them and put them down, then what is the safety and security for the people? So the war was not fought because of any personal rivalry or greed. That you know very well. You are prepared to come to an agreement, a pact with them, even getting one house with 5 rooms for you to live. This much you said. So it was not fought from your side because of greed. The greed was overpowering their minds. So it became inevitable. So the question arises, a true war is fought only when the fighters have a kind of a large network of involvements. It is not a question of fighting Duryodhana and the few brothers. Imagine so many warriors had come from the entire Jambu Dvipa and all of them subscribed to Duryodhana's view. And a few people subscribed to your view. So it was a fight of morality versus immorality, ethics versus non-ethics, truth versus untruth, virtue versus vice. Naturally something had to be done. So a fight becomes necessary. Nigrahena cha papanam sadhunam sangrahena cha. Though the war by itself is very painful and heartrending, there are 2 important points there. Papanam nigrahena, it is meant to destroy the wicked. Sadhunam sangrahena cha, for protecting the wise people. So in order to protect the wise people, good people, nice people, and destroy and restrain the wicked people, yajnair danaischa rajano bhavandi shuchayo amalaha. By your war, physically death has taken place. Inwardly what has taken place? The wickedness, the upper hand has been destroyed, dispensed with, and the virtue has been upheld. That part is something very good and benevolent. It is very benign. Yajna danaischa rajano bhavanti shujayo amalaha. By virtue of these twin factors, restraining and destroying the wicked, upholding and protecting the virtuous, then yajna and dana. What is meant by yajna? Anything that you do in the name of divinity and sublimity becomes a yajna. See, after all, we are living upon an earth. The earth is mostly surrounded by water, the seas. Both of them are surrounded by air, and the whole thing is still further surrounded by the sky and so many different forms of energy. Now, if you ask a question, where the endless universe, the space itself is resting, no answer. After all, we are living on a concrete earth. But the cause of this concrete and solid earth is something absolutely sublime and spatial. So today or tomorrow, any kind of a thought and inquiry about the world is bound to lead us to a state of divinity and sublimity. The whole earth, surrounded by something like space, is going on revolving there. Who supports what? What is behind what? Nobody will be able to say. How this balance is preserved, mutuality is preserved. Even inside the earth you will find it is liquid, further it is gaseous. So a sense of divinity is bound to strike any human mind when you think of inquiring into matters. So we naturally have a lot of gratitude towards the earth, indebtedness. It is the earth that supports our life. We are trampling on the earth, constructing our houses on the earth, using earth's own substances. We are breathing air, we are drinking water, we are basking in the sunshine, the moonshine, etc. So we have a lot of gratitude. When this gratitude is expressed in a very sublime manner, it becomes a yajna or a sacrifice. Anybody should do this yajna. How you do it is immaterial here. You must do it in one way or the other. That is why we have a number of mantras are there. A number of performances are there to generate an atmosphere of peace, an atmosphere of divinity.